Well, good afternoon and welcome to our February Ranching 101 webinar presented by AgTrust. Today, you will hear from an industry expert who will share essential strategies for maintaining herd health before spring and resources to protect the health and productivity of your cattle operation. Before we start, please join me for a short message from AgTrust.
When your passion is agriculture and a rural way of life, you need a partner who understands. That partner is AgTrust Farm Credit, formed from two trusted farm credit associations. Our mission is to provide personalized financing tailored for full and part-time farmers, ranchers, agribusinesses, and rural homeowners. And because we live in the communities we serve, AgTrust Farm Credit is here to help you succeed.
Well, as spring approaches, it's important to have practical strategies in place when keeping your cattle healthy. Today, we'll discover how to optimize nutrition, implement effective vaccine programs, and prevent common herd diseases. And today, you'll gain actionable tips to protect your herd, improve productivity, and reduce costly health issues. We're excited to have Dr. Carl Harborth join us today as our guest speaker. And if you have any questions during the webinar, please submit them in the chat box or in the Q&A box below. And at this time, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Harborth.
Well, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity to cover a very important topic. That's something that we can look at any point in time of the year, but at the same time, I think it's a good time because it's sort of, I don't want to say a downtime. It just depends on when your calving seasons are and where you're at in your operation. But like I said, at any point in time, I think it's very valuable to evaluate our herd health programs, to look at what's going on there. You know, we do have potential new threats on the horizon from a herd health standpoint that I'm not going to cover a whole lot today, but when we talk about biosecurity and doing everything we can to limit the amount of threats, then, we'll work through that and talk about a herd health plan today. When we discuss, I guess I need to share my screen, don't I? That would help. Okay. Hopefully y'all can see that.
Yes, you're good to go.
Perfect. When we talk about herd health, I think it's safe and smart to start when we start talking about prevention. And we're going to talk about vaccination programs. It's a key component of any herd health plan. I do want to say it is not a herd health plan. It is a component of that herd health plan. But when we talk about vaccinations or biosecurity, parasite control, anything we can do that is in a prevention mode, it is going to be cheaper than if we have to get into a treatment mode. So proactive versus reactionary is really what we're thinking about here. And as we work through this, there's 6 key components of a herd health plan. And we're going to talk about each one, some of them a little longer than others. We could probably spend an hour on each one of these and really get in depth. We're just going to touch and skim the top of every one of them and talk about the key components of them. Biosecurity, it's sort of become I don't want to say a buzzword. I really didn't want to say the buzz portion of that because of New World Screwworm, but we started using biosecurity, talking about biosecurity, because any kind of foreign animal disease that we're dealing with or talking about can be a serious threat to our operations. A key component of any of this is going to be a veterinary or valid veterinary client-patient relationship. Not just talking about getting prescribed medicines or anything along those lines. A veterinarian is someone who, 1, has the expertise, 2, has the ability to help us. But the component I like about a veterinarian and why I use mine quite a bit is they're an extra set of pair of eyes and hands at times when we're dealing with a lot of this. And they hear and see and know what's going on in our area typically before we do. It can save us a lot of money when it comes to taking care of some of these problems and actually being reactionary. They deal and work with a lot of operations, but either way, veterinary client-patient relationships became a big thing in 2017 when we started to see a lot of our antibiotics pulled behind the counter and scripts needed, and that became sort of a big buzzword. And I think it's very important to have that relationship. They can help us design these herd health plans. They can help us make a plan from the vaccination protocols, everything we're going to do moving forward. Biosecurity in our operations. Why is it important? Ultimately, we're trying to prevent and reduce the incidence and spread of disease. Regardless of what that disease is, anything that we can do from a preventative standpoint, and at the end of the day, we probably can't prevent everything, but we're going to try. If foreign animal disease such as foot and mouth disease or neural screwworm breaks out, having a biosecurity plan is going to be very crucial to us. One, it'll help us combat that, but two, at times, if we get into some kind of restrictive movement of livestock, having that in place actually will probably expedite our ability. At the end of the day, why is biosecurity important? Food safety. We're in the business of producing food. Ultimately, we're talking about beef today, but we're producing food, and we want to keep our U.S. beef the safest in the world. And having a biosecurity plan, ultimately a herd health plan, will help us do that. How is disease spread? Where are these threats coming from? They can come through the air. They can come from direct contact from animal to animal. There's also the oral aspect. We have reproductive diseases that can be spread. They can come in on vehicles, and I'm not talking necessarily about cars and trucks. I'm talking about equipment that we're not cleaning. We could spread disease that way. They can be vector-borne. We talk about the tick-borne diseases, and then through the soil and fomites. So there's a lot of ways that these threats can enter our operation. In the perfect world, we could stop every one of them and keep things closed, but that's just not realistic. Ultimately, looking to designing a herd health plan, a biosecurity plan, we're trying to limit these threats as much as possible. So when we move forward, I'm a trained nutritionist, so I really like to talk about nutrition, but all these components play into this together. When we start talking about the diseases that are threats, this is a very, very small list of them, but it's the more common list. If we start breaking these down, though, I think we can realize that there's certain times a year that these threats become more probable. There's certain times and points in an animal's life where they also are more of a threat. Because I'm not typically worried about reproductive diseases. I'm not worried about reproductive diseases in my newborn calves. Now, if I'm worried about replacement heifers, that's when I want to start preparing and being preventative there. So we have to also keep a focus on when we're designing, say, vaccination protocol, that we're going to be vaccinating at the right time. So, how that disease and when they show up by age, typically our younger animals have our enteric diseases. We talk a lot about the bovine viral diarrhea, scours, those type of things we typically see during the animals' younger months. As we get towards weaning in our calf operations, that's when we start to see a higher prevalence of respiratory disease. And as an animal matures, gets into the cycle of reproduction in the herd, the reproductive diseases become the threat. Now, we can see respiratory disease at any point in time, and we can see enteric disease at any point in time. But this is when they typically are the most likely to occur, most probable. Vaccinations are a key component of it. A lot of people sort of think vaccinations are their herd health program. And it's, as I've probably said many times already, and too many times already, it's probably a component of that. One thing we need to remember is we cannot have complete total disease protection in our operation. one, we don't have vaccinations out there for everything that's possibly a threat. They may not be as effective, nor we may not need to be spending the money on vaccinating for something that's not a very serious threat in our operation. We look at biosecurity, bringing in cattle, a lot of interest in growing the herd right now. How we grow that herd can dictate on how we handle the cattle that we're bringing in. Because if we're bringing in fresh cattle to our operation, if they are from an unknown source, ultimately, then we need to probably classify them and handle them differently than cattle that we raised or replacements that we produced on our own and we know the history of them. So all these things play into how high a threat level it might be coming into our operation. Having functional fences, functional gates, functional facilities make our lives easier, but they also keep unwanted things out and keep our animals in so they don't get exposed to possibly trick or something from a neighbor's herd, if that's a possibility, something along those lines. So to briefly talk about nutrition, and there are certain things that we look at in herd health, especially in the spring, from a nutritional standpoint. Nutrition is a year-round portion of this, though, because animals that are nutritionally stressed, it may be something that's very subtle, almost subacute, subclinical, where we can't see it, it still opens the door to possibly disease or other herd health issues. So keeping cattle, we talk about body condition. That's their gauge. How much fuel do they have in their tank? The Angus female on the top is a body condition score approximately a 5. That's what we consider ideal, and that's where we'd want them to be at calving. Now, I don't expect a cow to stay at a 5 year round. If she's lactating, nursing that calf, putting everything she can into that calf, she's probably going to lose a little bit of body condition depending on the time of year this is going on and how her nutritional resources align with her. Now, we want to keep these cows somewhere in this range between the Hereford cow on the bottom left versus the black-hided female on the right, in that 4 to 6 range. And that way we know, one, that when we ideally want to be at that 5 at calving. We know by looking at data historically that if we do that, we'll have the highest probability of those cows breeding back. Some other things to think about from a spring herd health standpoint that are nutritionally related. One of the big ones that gets compounded with spring calving herds is possibly some grass tetany, making sure we have a really reliable mineral that's palatable and cows want to eat, that's high in magnesium or higher in magnesium this time of year, can help prevent those type of issues. Also, if we think about what a lot of Texas, a lot of other parts of the country have been dealing with for inevitably a long time now, but any kind of drought situations where we don't have a whole lot of green grass around for an extended period of time, we can probably get some deficiencies in vitamin A and vitamin E. And, we may not absolutely see a problem with that. There could be some subacute or subclinical type situation where that's going to affect our reproduction in our herd. It might be small enough from just 10% effect that you don't really notice, but that effect could be there. So, we talk about spring calving. Where are we at on that? I mentioned a good mineral program in grass tetany, but making sure that cows are not deficient in energy, not deficient in protein. All of these things can play into the herd health factor, because if they get nutritionally stressed, compound that with environmental stresses of weather, we can open the door in our herd for a threat that might not be an issue if those cows are in good shape. Parasite control. Parasites, external parasites, has become quite the topic over the past year with the looming threat of New World screwworm, but it's something we've been dealing with, I would say, since the dawn of time, really, if you really think about it. But Parasite control is a pretty big one because parasites in our cow herd are going to take what they want to take and what they need. They're not going to pick and choose. They're going to just thrive in their own manner. So having a good parasite control program in place is paramount. The keys to that, though, depending on if we're talking about externals, internals, it really doesn't matter. The timing of those and when we treat and when we actually intervene become very, very important. So we talk about parasites, in pictures here, we're talking about the externals, flies, lice. One thing we do see a lot of time this time of year because they're sort of a cool season problem, but lice can be that way. Ticks and then grubs would be a possible another one. I've shown this a few times and I use it in my external parasite control presentations, but this ad I found in a 1954 issue of the Cattleman magazine online. When I first found it, I really didn't think much of the screwworm section of it, but that's become a pretty big talking point on it. The fact of the matter is we've been dealing with horn flies for a very, very long time. And it's been an issue that we probably will continue to deal with because they're not going away. And we've got to be as proactive as we can in preventing the effects that they have on our herd. We talk about internal and external parasite control. Really, we need a very strong integrated pest management program. Integrated pest management basically is just a program in which we break the life cycle of whatever pest we are trying to deal with. And this can be used in agronomic situations when we're talking about pests in our pastures or the ones that affect our animals directly. So what are the key components of a integrated pest management program? In a cattle operation, we're talking cultural, which is management, cleaning up manure pads, cleaning up hay feeding sites so we don't have those fly breeding grounds. There's a biological component. Those work really well in confined operations. But we also talk about the dung beetle would be another biological, or even a goldfish eating mosquito larvae in a pond would be a biological component of it. And then the chemical one we're all pretty versed on. And there's multiple chemicals, multiple options of delivery, internal or external, depending on which direction we're going there. And so all of these become a key component to have a very sound, successful integrated pest management program. We need to use multiple components from a cultural, biological, or chemical, and possibly even multiple chemical, depending on what we're doing. You're not going to get away with just using one. I can't put just fly tags in a cow herd and expect that to take care of my flies. I'm going to have to do a lot of different things to help break that fly life cycle. Mother Nature plays into it. I use this slide now when I'm talking about New World screwworm, and ended up creating this slide because I wanted to look at when the fly's life cycle was going to be an issue for us if we start dealing with it in the US. I kept it or put it in this presentation because there are times when flies are going to be very prevalent, and there's times when they're not going to be an issue. We're sort of in that time frame right now where flies are less active. Now we are in Texas. We were 90 degrees in January. We're going to be 85 degrees in South Texas this week, pretty heavily in the 90s. Flies aren't going away, but they're less active than they would be at prime times of the year for them. And so, do I really want to go out there and treat for my flies right now? Probably not. It's too early. The timing of it's not right. If I'm using an IGR though in my operation, it's something that I probably need to start thinking about, making sure I'm maybe not feeding it at this point or administering it through a bolus or however I'm going to deliver that IGR. It's something that I need to be thinking about, planning on starting to get into them because I want to get into that manure once we get into the fly season. So those flies, I can help break that fly cycle as we move forward. So managing internal and external parasites, it needs to be strategic. The great thing about it is most of our chemical products and those type of things are pretty broad spectrum. It's not like brush control where really and truly I need to use a specific compound on a specific species to get the best effect. For the most part, we work across the board. Ultimately, we do need to pay attention to what we're treating. We need to pay attention to what we're treating. We talked about the time of year. The one thing we haven't talked about right now is threshold. If I do have a fly problem early on, do I want to go ahead and start treating those cows, or what is the best threshold? And I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a second. What products to use, from a standpoint of alternating products. If you've got a problem where you're seeing possible some resistance, talk to your veterinarian. Some things are easier to treat for than others. Horn flies, sometimes face flies, we can treat pretty easily because how easy it is to apply those products to those areas. Stable flies might be a bigger issue because they don't spend a lot of time on the animal. Just to make sure everyone's clear, when we talk about New World screwworm, possibly treating our animals for them, we have to remember that they're only going to come in, lay their eggs in a wound, or probably possibly in a body orifice. They're not going to spend any time on the animal. So what we treat with and how we treat may not directly affect them. Now, indirectly, it may help us in battling New World screwworm because we don't have those fly irritations. We don't have tick bites, those type of things that open the door for the New World screw. We also need to be very cognizant of how much product we're using. We need to use the correct labeled amount on each animal. If we underdose, we open the door to resistance. Overdose, biggest thing there is we're possibly spending more money than we need to. I hate to say wasting money, but ultimately you are using more product than you need. Work with your veterinarian, read the labels, and dose properly when it comes to that. So we go back to that threshold thing. And it's like, when should we treat our flies? If you look at the literature, we talk about horn flies is really where most of this comes from. What threshold do we need to treat our fly or treat for flies? And the literature says 2 to 250 flies per animal is the threshold where we start to see an economic impact on our herd. So I asked you, how many flies is this? Obviously, if we were in a normal setting, I'd get responses back. So in this picture, there's 197 flies. We look at the fact that there could be on both sides of the animal. We're pretty close to being well within that threshold of what we needed to treat. I like to show this picture. I like to talk about that 250 to give you just an eye, sort of program you to think, well, how many flies do I need on an animal to make it worthwhile for me to treat? And this is really getting there. Now, this Brahman female here, probably not as many flies, probably not quite there yet, but we're getting close. 92 in the picture counted, close to double that on the whole animal, roughly. We're getting close, but there is a difference there. And this is just to show you what we're talking about when we talk about that 250 range. So vaccination protocols, as I mentioned early on, it's a lot of people just herd vaccination programs. That's a protocol. That's my herd health program. It's hard for me to talk about, a vaccination protocol because everyone on here today is in a different part of the state or in the region. There are also just probably different schedules from calving seasons, breeding seasons, all these things play into it. And so working with your veterinarian, going forward and making sure you have your bases covered is really what we need to talk about. Now, when we start looking at what we're going to vaccinate each group in our herd with, there are certain things. I'm not going to mention specific companies' products. I try not to. I like you to work with your veterinarian to see what works in your area and the direction you want to go, but I do want to talk about the vaccinations for calves, cows, and possibly replacements. And, in general, what are we looking at treating for here? And we've got to cover our bases, our clostridials, and also our bacterial and respiratory type diseases that we're dealing with there. When it comes to our replacements, that's when we start looking at making sure we're setting them up reproductively. So we want to make sure they get vaccinated for anything that could be a threat there. Brucellosis, lepto, the Campylobacter, the Vibrio, all those things, and making sure those products are in our protocols. One thing I'm not going to get into specifically, but I do want to mention, and I probably should mention it numerous times, is we can make a plan, we can buy the product, but if we don't handle the product properly, we don't administer the product properly, then we're wasting our time and money and probably shouldn't even worry about it. So making sure that we get these products, we don't buy them 6 months in advance, we don't have old product. We handle those products from the time they get to us to the time we administer them. All these things need to be part of our plan. Same thing here with our rebacks. What are our products are we going to be looking at rebacking every year, when? And these three slides here sort of break that out for us. Now I'm going to talk about the different types of vaccines a little bit. There's still a lot of research being done on figuring out what's, there's a lot of debate on what's best still. Kill vaccines versus modified live, and what you should use in your operation. The differences there is typically your kill vaccines are one dose. Typically, we need to keep them clean, keep them cool, keep them in shade. We don't really you don't want to buy, and this applies to really either one, your modified lives or your killed. Try to buy as close to what you're going to use, because you don't want to try to keep product, because once, especially we talk about the modified lives next, when we mix these products, because most of them come with a sterile diluent, and they'll also have the dried, dehydrated component of it that we mix, and that's when we use them. We don't want to mix this too far in advance. Typically an hour before we use them is what we recommend. One thing we need to remember to do when handling these is when we mix that bottle, we swirl them and don't shake it, because we don't want to destroy or break up any of the components of that. Once again, use within a couple hours. We need to keep them in a cool, clean environment. Looking at those labels, we don't want to freeze them. We don't want to put them in those situations where it might damage that product. Once we use it, once we mix it, if we don't use it up, we need to probably throw it away. Kill vaccines, in this slide here, I put this in here to talk a little bit about, if we're giving a 2-shot system, typically we prime with the first shot, and that second shot's ultimately what's going to give us our long-term effect from that. If we're giving calves shots at branding, say 3 months of age, and we come back and follow them up with their second shot based on the label, typically that maternal antibody is going to wear off. We usually get that maternal antibody for 2 to 3 months post weaning. Depending on what we're talking about, it can be different there, but this shows a little bit of how those vaccines are going to work. It's ultimately that vaccine response that we're talking about. Kill is going to be a little different than modified live. We do see a better response in some situations with modified lives. I'm not going to really get into the nuts and bolts of this today. I think working with your veterinarian on what's best and what's going to work best for you long term and make your program as bulletproof as possible. Where do we give those products? From a BQA perspective, we recommend to give all IM, intramuscular, or sub-Q shots in the neck. Alternative sites for sub-Q can be there in the dewlap or the elbow pocket down low. I tend to stay in that red box. And typically we got 2 sides and we can get the job done there. Pour-ons, we need to follow the label and pour them on as the label shows, because those products were designed and approved based on how they recommend you pour them on there. And I know we've all seen the videos on social media where people were just throwing things on cattle cups as they're running by, those type of things. That's not necessarily how those products were designed and approved by, so you might not get the same effect that they were approved by. And it might limit their efficacy in your operation. When we give those shots, make sure we give them per the labeled method, sub-Q, IM, however it is, intranasal, but also make sure we're very thorough and do that right also, not necessarily just from a BQA standpoint, just to make sure those products are effective. Come back on, what vaccines we're going to give at what time of year or to which group of the herd at what time of year. But, pre-calving, if we have a scours issue and working with our veterinarian determine that a vaccine might be effective there, giving that pre-calving would be something we need to do. Also, possibly calving if it becomes an issue to try to prevent any kind of major situations we're dealing with pre-breeding, making sure our cows and replacement heifers that are coming into the herd are set up to protect them as much as possible. Pre-weaning, once we get there, we've got to make sure we've got those calves set up so they're protected as much as possible when they go through that other really stressful time in their life, which would be weaning. If we can give them as much protection there as possible, we can possibly limit what happens to them. Back to that herd health plan. We talked about biosecurity and the importance of it. We talked about nutrition and how it plays in this, and how if we get deficient in some area of that, we could open the door. Parasite control, making sure vaccinations are there from a preventative standpoint. But there are genetic differences. There are other species that do a fantastic job, and that would be like the swine industry, where they look at a lot of these things from a genetics and herd health standpoint. I don't think the beef cattle side of things were there yet, but it is being looked at. And then stress. And there's a lot of different stressors that we deal with in our operations. Weather, hot heat stress can be one. Cold stress is one we're talking about now. Matching our livestock, the cattle we pick from a genetic standpoint to the environment that we're raising them is first and foremost. We don't want to stick something that's not going to do well in South Texas and vice versa. Case in point, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on that, but then we talk about stress here. We all talked about heat stress. We talk about cold stress, but calving and weaning are the two most stressful times in a calf's life. Everything we can do to make sure the matings that we have put together reduce calving difficulties. There's some that naturally are going to happen. It's just the percentages out there, but we are in control of those matings for the most part, and making sure that we limit or reduce that calving difficulty as much as possible can help, because the calf that goes through a stressful birth is going to be more prone to having herd health issues after that. Weaning, same situation. Most popular weaning month is the fall. We talk about October, November which is a bad joke, but dead calf months. Well, there's a reason for that. It's because it's when we wean a lot historically during the year. Each year, that's the time frame that we do a lot of weaning, and calves that are not properly prepared for that are at risk. So those stressors and doing what we can in our operation to limit that is very crucial. With that, I don't know if I'm close to on time, Bryn. With that, we can open up the questions. Hopefully you'll have some. I was trying to cover a lot in a short period of time.
We do have some questions in. The first one is relatively long, so I might split it up into some pieces for you. What about vaccinating for liver flukes? I'm just south of Dallas and have never had a problem or vaccinated for liver flukes until last fall when I lost 3 adult animals. Virtually no symptoms, appeared fine one day, and then they were dead the next. I assume the wet spring had something to do with this outbreed, but don't know for sure. Any ideas of what to do going forward? I did treat the herd.
Typically, and the vaccination side of it is, I have not looked at any of the data on that, so I really don't have a real sound answer for the vaccination for liver fluke standpoint. I would work with your veterinarian if that's something you need to work into your vaccination protocols, I definitely would suggest it. I do know when we get from, let's just keep it in general, we can have liver flukes in a lot of different places. They are more prevalent in wetter regions. And they are, and typically if you have them, you have them. And so you do need to work into your herd health plan protocols to help with that. And a lot of that would either be from a parasite control standpoint. I think there we have to just modify it to make sure we're covering for liver flukes. From a vaccination standpoint, I'm not going to say I'm going to plead the fifth, but definitely something I'll have to look into more and talk to those who in our program or in our system that have looked at that more. Typically, we just try to take care of it with our parasite control side of things.
Next question we have regarding dung beetles. Someone has purchased them in the past and would like to use them again, but they have not been able to find any. Do you have any recommendations?
I am not aware of a source to purchase them.
Okay.
It's interesting. I mean, well, there's a lot of debate when it comes to dung beetles from a standpoint of, from a parasite control standpoint, have we had an effect on the population of dung beetles? And I think there probably might be some argument there. There are products that don't affect them. And if you do have a healthy population, you need to make sure we look at that. And there's also a time of year when we use certain products on them that could affect those dung beetle populations.
Next question, how effective are IGRs and what time of the year to use, or are they all year long?
From a standpoint of what time of year, I think that's going to depend on your environment. As we go from north to south, it goes back to that fly activity chart. There's parts, we get pretty far south in Texas where we don't have enough cold weather to really reduce those fly populations as much as we would like. Now, back to efficacy. I'm a proponent for IGRs, either through however you feed them. There's also minerals available or boluses available now that were re-released a couple of years ago that are effective. This is, I don't want to say my opinion, but this is how I look at them. I have used them in our operation. I am hesitant to use them because I don't have control over my neighbor's operations. And I have a smaller acreage, say 100-acre pasture. The pastures around me, all my neighbors have cattle. If they're not using them, I'm not going to get the full effect of that product, is how I look at it. But I do want you to remember, I am a proponent for them and they do work. But you've got to be able to be assured that they're consuming that IGR. Because if I put it in a mineral and I have cows that don't consume it, then that IGR, and an IGR is an insect growth regulator, I guess, to fully explain for anybody who doesn't know what they are. It's a feed through product. We can feed it to that animal or we can put it in them in a bolus and it releases over time. It flows through them, it ends up in their manure. Flies lay their eggs in the manure. Ultimately, the larvae are consuming that manure, they consume that product, and it ultimately breaks the life cycle there. In a nutshell is what it does. It's a great tool to combine in any kind of parasite control program, but it's just one portion of it. They're not going to be the end all be all answer.
Is worm season in Central Texas the summer? Stool tests best to be done when and where?
So worm season, probably, if I heard the question correctly, Bryn. So warm season is going to be, well, it goes back to the other question on fly activity. Depending on where you are in Texas, it can change. But for the most part, our warmer months are going to be April through, well, right now is not the best time, but I guess it is the most current time. It seems like we're warm all the way through November. From a fecal, if I understand the question right, we're talking this in relation to parasite control for egg counts. And that is something I'd work with your veterinarian on. I mean, there's no reason to do fecal counts when you don't have, it's not prime season for them, I guess is the best way to put that. But if you're in a situation you think you have an issue, work with your veterinarian and they can help you do those fecal A counts to establish if you have a problem or not.
Mhm. So thinking about the weather right now too, what are your thoughts on, say we have a cold spell in the next couple weeks and we keep going back and forth from the cold spell to tiptoeing into the warmer months. What are some thoughts for producers to take into consideration whenever the weather is going back so much and fluctuating like it is?
It's from a herd tail standpoint, we're on the back half of winter for most of Texas. And at least you have to remember where I'm from and where I office out of in South Texas and Corpus. And I still fully expect us to have another one or two cold snaps come through. How bad they are depends on where you are in the state. If you're in Fort Worth, where y'all are right now, you'll probably see more of them because I think the fronts are coming through. We're just not seeing them in far South Texas. From a herd health standpoint, just maintaining, all of our normal winter aspects of that, making sure we don't forget about them if we get another cold snap, because a 45-degree rainy day is the worst thing in the world for a cow. In most of Texas, we don't deal with the cow that's on the picture or the screen right now that's got snow all over. That's just not the environment we deal with. That cow with a winter coat's going to be fine because she's insulated. But you throw a wet day into it, it really, really can stress them out from a cold stress standpoint. So that can open the door for things. As we start to see this spring green up, making sure we've got these cows on a mineral to possibly have any, if we're going to have issues, if you're a spring calver that can magnify any kind of milk fever issues, hypomagnesia, whatever we want to call it, we need to make sure we have that in place and they're consuming it already. We don't want to come in and be reactive in this situation. That's sort of where I wanted to go today, was talking about being proactive in a lot of things, being prepared, but making sure we just have a plan in place.
Mhm. So jumping back to the IGRs, what would you pair with the fly tags?
Okay.
Or
Typically,
sorry, I just read that wrong. Would you pair the IGRs with the fly tags?
you start getting into a situation where you can do a lot of things. We can throw everything, every tool we have available to us at them and spend a lot of money doing it. Now, and external parasites can cost us a lot of money. It's it's a tough one to answer because would I, in my operation, I don't know if I'd use both. It just depends on my environment, the situation I'm in. We start talking about good fly ears versus bad fly ears. Maybe I should say it the other way. I probably should say a bad fly ear versus a good fly ear. Flies environmentally, we get the moisture, flies can be an issue. We may need to up the ante on everything we do. And, there's a balance point there. From a standpoint of, I haven't seen a study that stacks all of these technologies on top of it to see which one's going to pay out the best. I do want to mention, we talked about how fly tags aren't directly going to protect our cows from New World screwworm if it becomes an issue, but they are going to prevent other flies and other issues creating sores, open wounds, scratches, those type of things, tick bites. We always have to remember that fly tags were actually tick tags when they were created that open that door for that fly to be able to lay eggs and ultimately have an infestation. And so you've got all of this going on. And I don't have a set fly abatement plan in our operation. We do use fly tags. Try to rotate. We rotate compound every year. I have not used IGRs consistently because of our situation and the size of pastures and proximity to herds that aren't using them. But I have used the boluses before just to experiment. But I couldn't tell you that they worked well or not because I don't have a study comparing. It's really hard to compare them when you're not using them in any form or fashion where I could confidently say, yes, they worked or no, they didn't, because we might have just had a good fly year, less flies. It didn't work out. Of course, you would think in a drier drought situation, we'd have less flies, but that's not always the case either. It doesn't always work that way.
Is feedlot vaccination program different than 10 cows in an open pasture?
Yes and no. I think at the cow herd level, we are starting and creating an immunity from a calf from the day he's born all the way through. So that means vaccinating the dam, making sure she's got a good immunity that she can pass her passive immunity onto that calf, vaccinating that calf, putting it on a protocol. It going forward, if we retain, not retain ownership, but we wean, we put them in a VAC 45, some kind of wean calf program that sets them up better. Each feedlot has a plan, program that they're following based on the advice from their veterinarian. They're not going to be looking at some of the diseases or worried about the threat of some of the diseases that we're going to be worried about at the cow herd level. But there are some that carry through all the way that we do need to be making sure that we're taken care of.
What about porons, oilers, and bovie rubs?
I think they're all good components of a external parasite control program. When it comes to the one thing I will say from a parasite control standpoint, the data that has been out there and shown that name brand products are still more reliable and more effective. There's some folks that do not like porons. If you look at the data, if we're talking about the same compounds, there's not really a big difference between the two. So I don't really have a preference there. From a standpoint, the oilers, rubbers, those, if we get into situations and they may be part of your protocols and they work and they're another way of delivering and just another aspect. When I went, if you go back to what I said in the parasite control and IPMs, integrated pest management, we get really focused on the chemical side, poron sprays, IGRs, this, that, and everything else. Anything we can do to outside of that to help break that life cycle from pasture management, those type of things will also help. But all those other possibilities of fly control are a key component of it. It's just what works best in your operation.
Are garlic blocks, or will garlic blocks work year round? Bad idea? Yes, no?
The data, that's one of those that we all sort of wanted to work really well. The data is hit and miss that comes out of the studies that use garlic. Now, there's a lot of debate on that because of the source of the garlic, what garlic oil, what garlic's being used in those products. And so I think that debate continues. Beyond that, if you ask me what my opinion of it is, the added cost, there's not enough data to support the added cost of putting that in there. You can make your mineral smell really good and smell like steak seasoning, but beyond that, it's not something at this point that I'm comfortable recommending because the data is just not strong enough to do it for me.
Could too many fly control methods cause harm to the animals, possibly poisoning them?
Well, I think, that's a good question. And if we need to follow products by label, And I think we don't really need to stack too many things at one time. Now, if I'm using a fly tag of a certain compound and I still have an excessive fly issue and I need to bring them into the corral and spray them with the permethrin product or some product that's labeled to do that, I don't think that's an issue. I do think that if we got excessive anything, too much of anything could be detrimental. But I've not seen anything that said that, there's certain products that can be only administered so many times in a certain amount of time frame. Most product, we look at some of the labels, and every label is going to be a little bit different, but if a product's labeled to work for 21 days, I wouldn't use that product any more often than that based on the label for that reason.
What do you think of apple cider vinegar?
I like to cook with it. I'm not, sorry, I wasn't trying to be that way, but there are some applications out there that I've read about. I don't know, there's really not any studies I've seen that show it work in a parasite control standpoint. There is some interesting from a standpoint of getting bulls to interact a little bit better if you've got a bunch of bulls grouped together, especially if they're novel to each other. But there's not a lot of, I'm not aware of a whole lot of research projects that have shown that.
And I should start off by saying I'm probably going to mispronounce this word, so bear with me. What are your thoughts on food grade diatomaceous earth mix
Diatomaceous earth.
into feeds?
The diatomaceous earth one, I think they've seen some benefits in certain species that it works pretty well. I think where we got to be careful with that one, and I'm not aware of a whole lot of research that has looked at it, is, diatomaceous earth. When we talk about a rumen environment, microbes, and there are a lot of good ones there that we want. Is there an effect there that we could see? There's so many other things going on there that I don't know if I would necessarily recommend using it in a ruminant's diet.
So you mentioned goldfish for mosquito larvae control. What other best practices for biological parasite control in operations and in pastures?
And we look at biological control. We talked about the dung beetle, and it'd be awesome if we could find a great source of that and populate and use that. The wasps, the parasitic wasps that are marketed, they work great in confined feeding operations, dairy operations, and other things, just because it's just not practical to get them into a pasture setting and make them super effective. We talked about goldfish. We talked about another one that's probably not desirable, but it is help as a biological control is fire ants. Fire ants will actually feed on fly larvae. And so, they're beneficial, but I'm not going to sit here and want to propagate those, right? So that becomes and those are the biologicals that are out there and available. I wish there were more, but there are possibilities there.
Yeah. Well, this has all been very helpful. We'll give everyone another 30 seconds or so, last final call for any questions that you might have. And if we don't get your questions answered today, please feel free to email education@tscra.org or Dr. Harborth. He just put his information up on the screen. Please feel free to email either of us, and we're happy to get your questions answered if you do not get them answered today. But do you have any final remarks for the group as we're waiting on any final questions to be submitted?
I'm not really prepared, no.
That's okay. You covered a lot of information, which is very helpful. And it does look like we just had one more question get submitted. So, do you have an opinion on fly predators?
I assume by fly predators, they're talking about the parasitic wasp, or I'm not sure exactly when you say fly predators. Are we talking? I guess I'd probably need a little more clarification on they're referring to as fly predators, or maybe I'm just being dim.
I very well could be mispronouncing it as predators. Spalding Labs sell fly predators. Spalding Labs.
Oh, they're coming back to particular. I don't know, honestly.
Okay.
To be honest with you, I don't have an opinion. And I have to do a little more research, to be honest with you.
Okay. Another question about dung beetles. I have dung beetles in summer, but turkeys eat them. How do I stop the turkeys from eating the dung beetles?
Find a lot of people like to hunt turkeys. No, I'm not being, I really don't have a good idea for you on that. I haven't, it doesn't surprise me at all. Unfortunately, it's the circle of life in that situation. It's, but that would be possibility. It's not that I don't like turkeys either. They're sort of fun to hunt, but
Well, Dr. Horber, thank you for joining us today.
sure.
We will give everyone back 3 minutes of their day and just wanted to thank everyone who joined us for today's Ranching 101 webinar. And we hope everyone has a great afternoon and look forward to seeing you all on March 17th for the next Ranching 101 webinar, where we will discuss managing forages and pastures for spring growth. Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank y'all.